Carol Whitmore called the cops on me for moving out. Yes, you heard me right. For packing boxes and trying to leave my own home. I stood on my front porch, watching as the blue and red lights of 5 patrol cars painted violent streaks across my neighbors' darkened houses. Officers were taking cover behind their car doors, hands resting on the holsters of their weapons, their faces grim in the pulsing light. All of this, all of it, because Carol Whitmore, our immaculate and tyrannical HOA president, had decided that no one, and I mean no one, leaves the pristine prison of Willowbrook without her personal blessing. But Carol, in her blind arrogance, made one fatal mistake that night. She had no idea who was stepping out of that 5th patrol car. She didn't know that the deputy she was about to lie to was my son. The flashing lights, the tension thick enough to taste, the cold knot of fear in my stomach. None of it happened overnight. It wasn't a sudden explosion. It was a slow burn. A 6-week war of attrition that began not with a gunshot, but with the simple, hopeful sound of a hammer. Each strike of the hammer felt like a betrayal. The sharp thwack echoing in the quiet morning air, a final percussive end to my life in this house. The for sale sign stood there, stark and white against the green grass. A public declaration that my world had come apart at the seams. The hardest thing I ever had to do was say goodbye to my wife, Sarah. The second hardest was driving that sign into the lawn she'd loved more than anything. It wasn't in the ground for more than 5 minutes. And then she appeared. Carol Whitmore. She didn't just walk across the street from her own immaculate property. She emerged as if summoned by the disturbance. There was a predatory stillness about her, a coiled energy beneath the perfectly pressed Lululemon outfit she wore like a suit of armor. Carol was the queen of our little Willowbrook HOA, and she ruled her kingdom with an iron will and a smile that was all engineering and no warmth. "David, good morning," she called out. Her voice was honey-sweet, but it had an edge, like fine crystal that could shatter at any moment. Her eyes, a pale, calculating blue, flicked from me to the sign and then lingered on the house itself. It was a look I'd seen before, but never understood. A strange mix of appraisal and hunger. "I see you're undertaking a new project," she said, her lips forming the words perfectly. "Just a necessary change, Carol," I managed, my hand still tingling from the hammer's vibration. She made a soft, tutting sound. "Well, change can be complicated here in Willowbrook. We have our standards to maintain, of course, for everyone's benefit." She took a step closer, her expensive sneakers silent on the pavement. "I do hope you've reviewed Section 14, subsection C, of the bylaws regarding property transfers. It's quite specific." I hadn't, and we both knew it. "This house," she continued, her voice dropping into a more confidential, almost conspiratorial tone. "It has such a wonderful history in the neighborhood. It would be a terrible shame if someone new were to move in who didn't appreciate its true value." The way she said it sent a prickle of unease down my spine. It wasn't about curb appeal or market price. It felt like a warning. She gave one last, thin smile, turned with the precision of a soldier on parade, and glided back to her own pristine kingdom. I watched her go, then turned and went inside, the heavy front door clicking shut behind me. The silence of the house rushed in. It was always too quiet now. Ever since Sarah passed last spring, the silence had been a physical presence, a weight in every room. My gaze drifted to her picture on the mantelpiece, the one from our anniversary trip to the coast. Her head was thrown back in laughter, the sun catching the silver in her hair. God, I missed that laugh. We bought this house together. We'd painted these walls, planted those rose bushes. Her touch was everywhere, and now, living here alone, it wasn't a comfort. It was a constant, gut-wrenching reminder of everything I'd lost. That's why I had to leave, not because I wanted to, but because I needed to. I picked up the phone and dialed Jake, my son, a deputy sheriff over in the next county. "Hey, Dad, I'm in the middle of something. Everything okay?" I told him about the sign, about Carol's immediate appearance. I tried to explain the odd feeling she gave me. He sighed, a loving but weary sigh. Dad, that's just Carol being Carol. She does that to everyone. It's how she gets her kicks. This felt different, Jake. There was something else there. Look, he said, his voice a little rushed, if she hits you with a fine, just pay it. It's not worth the stress. Okay, I promise I'll swing by this weekend. Gotta go. The line went dead. I stood there, phone in hand, feeling more alone than I had before I'd called. He thought it was about neighborhood rules. He didn't see what I saw. It wasn't about power. It was something closer to desperation. Later that evening, as dusk settled, I went out to pull the trash cans to the curb, and I saw it. A crisp, bright orange envelope secured to my front door with a heavy piece of packing tape. The official seal of the Willowbrook Homeowners Association was printed in a severe black font at the top. With a sense of dread, I tore it open. It wasn't a fine for the "for sale" sign. That would have been too simple. It was a violation notice, a fine for $500. It was for, and I quote, an unapproved and non-uniform coloration of decorative pebbles in the small memorial garden Sarah had built for her mother by the side of the house, a garden that had sat untouched and unchanged for nearly 3 years. And that's when I knew for certain. This was never about the rules. This was about something else entirely, something hidden, something buried. I stood there in the fading light of my own hallway, the orange violation notice trembling slightly in my hand. $500 for the color of pebbles in a garden that was more a headstone for my wife's memory than a piece of landscaping. The absurdity of it was staggering. But underneath the absurdity was a cold, clear message. This was a shot across the bow. This was Carol telling me, in no uncertain terms, that she could touch anything, that nothing was off limits, nothing was too petty, and nothing was sacred. My first instinct was anger, a hot, righteous anger that made me want to march across the street and throw the notice in her perfectly composed face. But then I thought of Sarah. I could almost hear her voice, calm and steady as it had been even in her final days. Don't fight with fire, David. You'll just burn yourself. Fight with wisdom. So I took a deep breath. I walked over to my desk, pulled out a fresh legal pad and wrote down the date, the time, and the details of violation number 1. Then I wrote a check for $500, put it in an envelope, and walked it over to the HOA drop box. I wouldn't give her the satisfaction of a confrontation. Not yet. I was playing the long game, or so I told myself. What I didn't realize was that I was already in the middle of a war, and my opponent had been planning her campaign for years. The next 2 weeks were a masterclass in psychological warfare. My real estate agent, a kind woman named Susan, scheduled an open house. She was optimistic. The market was good, and our house, with Sarah's touches, had a warmth that photographs couldn't capture. The first couple to arrive, the Millers, seemed to feel it too. They were young, expecting their first child, and I could see them picturing their life here. The wife was admiring the rose bushes Sarah had planted by the porch, and then it started. A deafening roar erupted from next door. Carol, dressed in what looked like a hazmat suit, had decided that this exact moment was the perfect time to use a commercial-grade leaf blower to attack a single imaginary leaf on her driveway, right at the edge of my property line. The noise was incredible, a high-pitched scream that made conversation impossible. Mr. Miller tried to shout a question, but the words were swallowed by the noise. Susan shot me an apologetic look and bravely tried to lead them to the backyard. The moment they were out of sight, the leaf blower stopped, but a new sound began. From an open window in Carol's house, opera music, something loud and tragic, blasted out at a volume that shook my window panes. The Millers left quickly, their smiles tight and strained. 2 more potential buyers came that day. During the second visit, Carol's sprinkler system mysteriously turned on, sending a high arc of water directly onto the walkway to my front door, drenching a lovely older couple. During the third, a loud, profanity-laced argument, which sounded suspiciously one-sided, echoed from her backyard. By the end of the day, Susan was furious. "This is illegal, David," she said, her cheeks flushed with anger. "This is tortious interference. We can send a cease and desist." "And give her exactly the fight she wants?" I asked, feeling a weariness settle deep in my bones. Let's just keep trying." But it got worse. The harassment became more personal, more invasive. I started to feel watched. I'd be washing dishes and catch a flicker of movement in her upstairs window, the glint of a camera lens. I'd be reading on the porch in the evening, and her car would cruise by, impossibly slow, before disappearing around the corner. One night, I couldn't sleep. I was standing in my dark living room, just looking out at the quiet street when a sudden, bright flash lit up my window. It was a camera flash from her house. She was photographing me in my own home in the middle of the night. The feeling it gave me, it was suffocating. I felt like a prisoner. The walls of the house, once a comfort, were starting to feel like they were closing in. The quiet I once sought was now filled with a creeping dread. Every creak of the floorboards made me jump. Every car that passed by too slowly made my heart hammer in my chest. This wasn't just about stopping me from selling a house. This was a siege. Carol was trying to break me. I just couldn't for the life of me figure out why. Why this house? Why me? The questions circled in my mind, a relentless, unanswerable loop. I knew I couldn't figure it out alone. My break came, as they sometimes do, in the most mundane of places, the produce aisle of the grocery store. I was staring blankly at a wall of tomatoes, my mind a million miles away, when a soft voice beside me said, "You're David Thompson, aren't you?" From the corner house on Willow Way. I turned to see a woman in her late 40s, her dark hair pulled back in a simple ponytail. There was a kindness in her eyes, but also a weariness I recognized because I saw it in my own mirror every morning. "I am," I said. "I'm Elena Garcia. I used to live 2 doors down from you. My husband and we moved out about 18 months ago." She paused, glancing around as if she were afraid of being overheard, even here. "I saw your for sale sign, and I've heard things. I just wanted to say, be careful. With Carol." The way she said the name, a quiet chill, confirmed she wasn't just another neighbor. She was a fellow survivor. "It's more than just the rules with her, isn't it?" I asked, my voice low. She gave a short, bitter laugh. "The rules are just the stick she uses to beat you with. It's never about the rules." She hesitated, then seemed to make a decision. Could I buy you a cup of coffee? There are some things you should know." An hour later, we were sitting in a quiet corner of a local coffee shop. The smell of roasted coffee beans was a welcome change from the sterile tension of my house. "I was on the HOA board with her for a year," Elena began, stirring her latte. "I volunteered because I thought I could do some good. A fatal mistake." She told me how she'd started asking questions about the financials. Why was the landscaping contract awarded to a company with no local address and a price tag 30% higher than any other bid? Why were special assessment fees being levied for sidewalk repairs that never happened? "The moment I started asking questions," Elena said, her gaze distant, "my life became a living hell. It started small. Fines for my husband's work truck being parked on the street for 10 minutes too long. Notices that our flower beds weren't in compliance with the approved color palette. Absurd things, just like what you're experiencing." She leaned forward, her voice dropping to a whisper. "But then she came after my business. I ran a small, licensed baking business out of my home. Cakes, cookies for birthdays, that sort of thing. Carol started a rumor that I had a pest infestation. She filed anonymous complaints with the health department. My customers got scared off. My business, the one I'd built for 5 years, it dried up in less than a month. We had to sell. We couldn't afford to stay." "I'm so sorry, Elena," I said, and I meant it. "Here's the part you need to hear, David," she said, her eyes locking onto mine. "When we sold, we were desperate. We took the first lowball cash offer that came along. It was from an LLC I'd never heard of. It was only 6 months later, when I did some digging, that I found out who was behind the LLC. She paused for effect. It was Carol's younger brother. I felt a cold knot form in my stomach. She'd done it to 2 other families before me, Elena continued. The same pattern: harassment, fines, intimidation, until the homeowner is so desperate to escape they'll sell for anything. Then her brother swoops in. She's not just a power-hungry bully, David. She's running a racket." She took a sip of her coffee. "But here's the strangest thing. With you, it's different. She never tried to buy my house, or the others, before we put them up for sale. With your property, it's always been different. I remember years ago, long before you were even thinking of selling, she tried to get the HOA to buy your lot, to convert it into a community green space. No one understood it. It made no sense. She was obsessed with your specific piece of land." She leaned in even closer. "And there was a story. Something that happened a long time ago, before you and Sarah even moved in. Carol had a business partner back then, a man she started a real estate venture with. One day, he just vanished. Left town, people said. Left her holding the bag. She never spoke of him again. But the timing, it was right around the time the previous owners of your house sold it in a hurry." Elena sat back, her story finished. She had just handed me the missing piece of the puzzle, or rather, she'd shown me that the puzzle was infinitely larger and darker than I could have imagined. This wasn't just about flipping houses for a profit. The desperation I'd seen in Carol's eyes, it was the desperation of someone protecting a secret that was somehow connected to my home, to the ground beneath my feet. My hands were shaking slightly as I dialed Jake's number again. This time, I didn't waste time with pleasantries. "Jake, we need to talk. Not on the phone. Can you come over?" My tone must have conveyed the urgency, because he just said, "I'll be there in an hour." When he arrived, I sat him down at the kitchen table, a place of 1,000 family dinners, and laid out everything Eleanor had told me. The financial scheme, the pattern of harassment, the shell companies run by her brother, and finally, the story of the vanished business partner and Carol's strange, long-standing obsession with our property. I watched my son's face change as I spoke. The weary skepticism was gone, replaced by the sharp, analytical focus of a cop. The lines around his eyes tightened. He wasn't just listening as a son anymore. He was listening as an officer of the law. "A vanished partner?" he said slowly, the words hanging in the air. "That's a hell of a loose thread." "I think the thread is buried in my backyard, Jake." He was silent for a long time. "Okay," he said finally. "Okay, Dad, this is more than just HOA craziness. I'll start digging, unofficially. I'll check property records, the LLCs Elena mentioned, and I'll run the name of that business partner, see if he really just left town." A wave of relief washed over me. Finally, someone believed me. I wasn't alone in this anymore. That relief lasted for exactly 2 days. My phone rang on a Tuesday afternoon. It was Jake. I said hello, but was met with silence. For a moment, I thought the call had dropped. "Jake, you there?" "Yeah," he finally said. His voice was flat, devoid of all emotion. It was a voice I'd never heard from him before, and it terrified me. "Dad, she did something." "What? What did she do?" "She filed a complaint against me. With Internal Affairs," he took a ragged breath. "An anonymous complaint. It claims that a resident of Willowbrook felt threatened and intimidated by a deputy who was using his position to interfere in a private civil matter. It says I've been running license plates, accessing restricted databases, and stalking a private citizen." "Her!" I felt the blood drain from my face. "No. Yes," he said, his voice cracking with a rage he was barely holding in check. "They called me in this morning. I had to sit in a sterile little room and listen to some lieutenant read her fabricated lies off a sheet of paper. They took my badge, Dad, and my service weapon. I'm on administrative leave, pending a full investigation. Oh, son, I'm so sorry. This is my fault. No, he snapped, the anger finally breaking through. This is not your fault. This is her. She's trying to neutralize me. She must have seen my patrol car here, or maybe she has a source inside the department. She's trying to discredit me before I can find anything. She's not just a crook, Dad. She's smart, and she's vicious. He fell silent again. The weight of what she'd done settled between us. She hadn't just come after my home. She had come after my son's life, his career, his honor. The fight was no longer about a piece of property. It was about my family. That evening, Jake's personal pickup truck pulled into my driveway. He walked into the house, his face set like stone. He looked older than he had 2 days ago. He sat down across from me at the kitchen table. The battlefield. The IA investigation means I can't officially touch this case, he said, his voice low and steady now, filled with a new cold resolve. If I do, it proves their point, and I'll lose my career for good, so we can't fight this through official channels. He leaned forward, his eyes locking with mine. She thinks she's backed us into a corner. She thinks she's scared us off. A grim, humorless smile touched his lips. But she just gave us our new strategy. She wants a secret. Fine. We're going to convince her that we're about to dig it up. We sat there at my kitchen table, the same table where Sarah and I had planned vacations and paid bills, and we mapped out a war. Jake's voice was low and steady, the voice of a man who had seen the worst in people and learned to think 3 steps ahead. She's desperate, he said, tapping a finger on the table for emphasis. And desperate people make mistakes. We just have to give her the right opportunity to make a big one. The plan was simple in its concept, but terrifying in its execution. We were going to give Carol exactly what she feared most. The imminent and certain excavation of my backyard. We wouldn't do it with a threat. We'd do it with paperwork. The next morning I typed up a formal letter to the Willowbrook HOA Board of Directors. I used the most official language I could muster, pulling phrases from the bylaws Carol herself had written. I was submitting for architectural review a proposal for a significant landscaping project. It would be a Sarah Memorial Garden, a name I chose specifically, hoping it would add a layer of plausibility and perhaps foolishly touch some long-dormant piece of her humanity. The proposal detailed a multi-level stone patio, a deep-set water feature, and a new retaining wall, all of which would require extensive excavation and foundation work to a depth of at least 6 feet. I signed it, sealed it, and dropped it in the HOA Dropbox, feeling as though I'd just mailed a declaration of war. For the next 2 days, I watched, and I saw the first cracks in Carol's perfect facade. She was constantly on her phone, pacing back and forth on her pristine driveway. A landscaping truck, one I'd never seen before, parked at her house for a full day, and I saw her walking the property line with a man in a hard hat, pointing frantically toward my yard. The predatory calm was gone, replaced by a frantic, buzzing energy. The trap was set. The bait was taken. Now all we could do was wait for the animal to step into the snare. The night before the supposed excavation was scheduled to begin was the longest night of my life. A little after 10 p.m., Jake's quiet pickup truck pulled into my driveway. He wasn't in uniform. He was my son, here to help his father. He carried a small, nondescript black bag. "All right, Dad," he said, his voice a low whisper as he closed the door behind him. "Let's get this done." Inside the bag was a high-resolution, night vision motion-activated camera. It was no bigger than a deck of cards. "It's not official department issue," he said, answering my unspoken question. "It's my own, for watching deer, mostly." We moved through the darkened house like ghosts. Every step felt magnified, every sound a potential betrayal. We slipped out my back door into the deep shadows of the yard. The air was cool and still. A sliver of moon offered just enough light to see by. Jake, with the quiet efficiency of his profession, found the perfect spot, a dense knot of foliage in my neighbour's overgrown hedges, which offered a clear, unobstructed view of my front porch and, more importantly, the entire front of Carol's house across the street. He worked silently, securing the camera, angling it just right. I stood watch, my heart hammering against my ribs. This felt so wrong, so outside the boundaries of the quiet life I had always lived. A grieving widower and his suspended cop son planting a spy camera in the dead of night. It was the stuff of movies, not my life. "It's active," Jake whispered, checking the feed on his phone. "We'll see anything that moves out here." We retreated back inside, and the waiting began. We sat in the dark living room, not speaking, just watching the windows of Carol's house. The minutes stretched into an hour, then 2. The silence was heavy, thick with anticipation. It felt like the deep, held breath before a plunge into icy water. All we needed was for her to make her move. It happened at 2:17 a.m. The sound shattered the night silence. A sharp, explosive crash of breaking glass followed a second later by a single theatrical shriek that was designed to wake the dead. My adrenaline spiked, even though I knew it was a performance. Jake was on his feet instantly. "Showtime," he breathed. We didn't move. We stayed inside, watching as lights flicked on in neighboring houses. Within 3 minutes, the night exploded. The first siren wailed in the distance, then another and another, until our quiet suburban street was a chaotic vortex of flashing red and blue lights. I saw the first patrol car scream to a halt in front of my house, then a second, a third. Doors flew open. Officers, young and tense, took cover, their weapons drawn. "This is the police, occupant of 12 Willow Way. Come out with your hands in the air." A voice boomed through a megaphone. My breath hitched. This was it. "Stay calm, Dad," Jake said, his hand on my shoulder. "Let them follow their training. Don't make any sudden moves." I opened my front door and stepped onto the porch, raising my hands into the blinding glare of a spotlight. My heart felt like it was going to beat its way out of my chest. Across the street, I could see the main event. Carol was on her front steps, wrapped in a silk robe, a towel pressed to her forehead. She was weeping hysterically, her body trembling. An officer was gently trying to guide her toward an ambulance that had just arrived. She looked up, saw me, and her expression of terror sharpened into one of pure, venomous accusation. "That's him!" she screamed, her voice cracking. "He did it! He broke my window! He said he was going to shut me up for good!" She pointed a trembling finger directly at me. It was an Oscar-worthy performance. The lead officer, a burly sergeant I didn't recognize, started advancing toward my porch. "Sir, I need you to get on your knees, now!" But just then, Jake's truck, which he'd parked down the street, pulled up quietly, its interior light coming on. Jake stepped out, not with aggression, but with a calm authority that cut through the chaos. He held up his own badge. "Sergeant!" he called out, his voice clear and steady. "Deputy Jake Thompson, hold your position." The sergeant froze, confused. "What's going on, Thompson? This is an active crime scene." "I know what it looks like," Jake said, walking calmly toward him. "But I think you need to see something first." He pulled out his phone, tapped the screen, and showed it to the sergeant. I couldn't see the screen from where I was, but I saw the sergeant's face. I saw his eyes widen. I saw his jaw tighten. He motioned to another officer who leaned in to look. His reaction was the same. The sergeant looked from the phone to a sobbing Carol, and then to me, a completely new understanding dawning in his eyes. He keyed his radio. "All units, stand down!" I repeat, stand down. The tension on the street broke like a fever. Officers lowered their weapons, their faces a mixture of confusion and relief. Jake walked across the lawn, past the officers, and stopped directly in front of a still sobbing Carol. Her performance faltered for a second as she saw the look on his face. What is this?" she stammered. "It's called evidence, Carol," Jake said, his voice dangerously quiet. "The camera I put up tonight got some great footage, high definition. It clearly shows you throwing a brick out your own window from the inside, then screaming about 5 seconds later. It's very compelling." The color drained from Carol's face. The mask of the terrified victim didn't just slip, it shattered into a million pieces, revealing the raw, ugly face of pure hatred and panic beneath. She looked from Jake to the other officers, to me, her mind racing, realizing the trap had not been for me, but for her. Jake pulled out his handcuffs. The metallic click echoed in the sudden silence. "Carol Whitmore," he said, his voice ringing with the cold, clean finality of the law. "You are under arrest for filing a false police report and knowingly making false statements to law enforcement." She stared at him, speechless, as he reached for her wrist. In that moment, she wasn't the Queen of Willowbrook anymore. She was just a cornered criminal, brought down by a grieving husband, his loyal son, and the truth. The clicking sound of the handcuff snapping onto Carol's wrists was the loudest thing I had ever heard. It sliced through the night, a sharp, metallic finality that ended her reign more effectively than any vote or petition ever could. Her face, illuminated by the cold, swirling lights, was a mask of pure, reptilian rage. There was no remorse, no fear, just the fury of a queen whose castle had been stormed. She was shoved, gently but firmly, into the back of a patrol car. She didn't say a word. She just stared at me through the window, her eyes promising a retribution that for the first time she had no power to deliver. The whole street seemed to exhale at once. Neighbors who had been peeking through their blinds were now stepping out onto their porches, their faces a mixture of shock and something that looked a lot like liberation. The burly sergeant who had nearly arrested me walked over, his face etched with apology. "Mr. Thompson," he said, his voice low and full of gravel. I am profoundly sorry for how this was handled. We were responding to a report of a home invasion and assault." "You were doing your job, Sergeant," I said, my own adrenaline starting to recede, leaving a hollow, trembling feeling in its place. Jake came over and stood beside me, his presence a solid, comforting anchor in the swirling chaos. "Her false report and assault on an officer gives us everything we need, Dad," he explained quietly to me, but loud enough for the sergeant to hear. "We're getting a warrant, a full one. We're going to search her house, her financials, and with your permission, your property." I looked from my son's determined face to the yellow crime scene tape that officers were now beginning to unspool around my front yard, the yard Sarah had loved. "Permission granted, Sergeant," I said, my voice clear and steady. "Do whatever you have to do. Find out what this was all about." Morning arrived not with the roar of my planned excavators, but with the quiet, methodical precision of a forensics team. The flashing lights were gone, replaced by the pale, watery light of dawn. The neighborhood was quiet, but it was a different kind of quiet now. It was the hush of a crowd waiting for a verdict. I sat in my kitchen, a mug of coffee growing cold in my hands, and watched them work. They didn't dig randomly. Jake had told them everything Elena had told me, and they focused their attention on one specific area. A deep, overgrown flower bed near the back of the property line, shaded by an old oak tree. It was a section of the garden Sarah had never liked. She said the soil there was always wrong. 2 technicians in gloves and boots began to dig, carefully removing layers of earth, sifting it onto a tarp. The work was slow, almost tedious. An hour passed, then another. I watched them, my heart a slow, heavy drum in my chest. What would they find? A weapon? Stolen money? The questions that had haunted me for weeks were about to be answered. Around 11 a.m., one of the technicians stopped. He knelt down, brushing away dirt with a small brush. He called out to the lead detective. "Sir, I think I've got something." My coffee mug clattered as I set it down, my hands suddenly unsteady. I walked to the back window for a better view. They were unearthing a metal box. It was old, a heavy-duty lockbox, from the look of it, about the size of a shoebox. It was rusted and caked with years of damp earth. It took 2 of them to lift it out of the hole. They carried it over to a folding table they'd set up. The detective used a crowbar to pry open the corroded lid. It gave way with a groaning screech of tortured metal. Even from the window, I could feel the atmosphere change. The team leaned in. The detective reached inside with a gloved hand. Later, Jake would tell me exactly what they found. It wasn't just one thing. It was a time capsule of a crime. First, there were financial ledgers, 2 sets of them. One showed the legitimate, though failing, books of a real estate venture from 2 decades ago. The other showed the real numbers. A systematic siphoning of funds, tens of thousands of dollars, into an offshore account. An account in Carol Whitmore's name. Second, there were property deeds, signed over under duress. And a signed, tear-stained confession. Not from Carol, but from her business partner, the man Elena said had vanished. In the letter, he took the blame for everything, for the embezzlement, for the failure of the company, and stated his intention to leave town forever and never return. The signature was shaky, forced, and last, tucked at the very bottom of the box, was the final, damning piece of evidence. It was the man's wallet. Inside was his driver's license, a few faded photos of a family I didn't know, and a thin silver ring engraved with his initials. He hadn't just vanished. Carol had ruined him, bled him dry, blackmailed him into signing away his life, and forced him to flee with nothing. This box was her insurance policy, buried on a piece of land she was determined to control forever, ensuring her secret would stay buried with it. My desire to sell the house had become a direct threat to her entire life, a life built on a foundation of lies and cruelty. The ripple effect was immediate. Jake called me that afternoon. His voice was lighter than I'd heard it in years. "It's over, Dad," he said. "The IA complaint was dropped with a formal apology from the department. They gave me my badge back." He paused. "They offered me a commendation for my role in uncovering the Whitmore case. I told them to just thank my dad for being stubborn." I laughed, a real, genuine laugh. It felt good. The news ripped through Willowbrook like a summer storm. The fear that Carol had cultivated for years evaporated overnight. People started talking to each other again. That evening, Eleanor came over, carrying a freshly baked apple pie. Her eyes were shining with tears. "You did it, David," she whispered, giving me a hug. "You set us all free." Other neighbors followed. One dropped off a case of beer. Another just stopped by to shake my hand, a silent acknowledgement of the battle I'd fought for all of them. They weren't just neighbors anymore. They were allies, a community. I stood on my porch that evening, watching the last of the police vehicles drive away. The yellow tape was gone. All that was left was a neat rectangular hole in my backyard. A hole where a terrible secret had been buried. I looked at that patch of turned earth, and for the first time since Sarah died, I didn't feel the weight of the past. I felt the promise of the future. The hole in my yard could be filled, but the hole in the community, the one Carol had spent years digging, that was finally starting to close too. The hole in my backyard was the first thing to be filled. The hole in the community took a little longer. The months that followed Carol's arrest were a strange, cleansing tide. The full scope of her crimes became the talk of the town. It turned out the story of her vanished business partner was just the beginning. The investigation unearthed years of embezzlement, fraud, and systematic blackmail. She had ruled Willowbrook not as a president, but as a warden, and the trial was swift. Carol Whitmore was sentenced to 12 years in federal prison. There would be no parole. Her conviction broke the spell of fear that had hung over our neighborhood for a decade. The old compliant HOA board resigned in shame. In a special election, Elena Garcia was voted in as the new president. Her first act was to hold a community barbecue and shred half of Carol's ridiculous rulebook. Overnight, the atmosphere changed. People started talking to each other over their fences again. Front yard gardens, once a finable offense, began to bloom all over Willowbrook. The sound of children's laughter seemed to return to the streets. Amidst this rebirth, something shifted in me too. I took the "For Sale" sign down. The house no longer felt like a museum of my grief. The shadows were gone. Facing down the darkness Carol had buried here had, in a strange way, cleansed the property of its ghosts. It wasn't just Sarah's house anymore. It was my house, a place I had fought for, a place I had won back, and I knew what I had to do. I started work on the Sarah Memorial Garden, not the fake one from my proposal, but a real one. The day I brought in the first load of flagstones, my neighbor from 2 doors down, a man I'd barely spoken to in years, came over with his wheelbarrow and offered to help. The next day, 2 more came. We filled the hole where the lockbox had been, and on that spot we built a beautiful stone bench. We planted new rose bushes, laid fresh sod, and built a small bubbling fountain whose gentle sound replaced the memory of sirens and shouting. It wasn't just my project, it became the neighborhood's, a quiet shared act of reclaiming our peace. My son Jake, his name cleared and his career more secure than ever, came by every Sunday. He'd bring coffee, and we'd sit on the new bench watching the garden grow. One sunny afternoon, as we were sitting there, he turned to me. "You know," he said quietly, a soft smile on his face, "Mum would have loved this. All of it." I looked around at the thriving flowers, at the sunlight dappling through the leaves of the old oak tree. I thought of the long, dark journey it took to get here. Sarah had always told me, quoting some old farmer's wisdom, that what you plant is what you'll eventually harvest. Carol had planted fear and secrets, and she had harvested a prison cell. We had been left with a hole in the ground, and out of it, together, we had grown peace.